Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, we'll review how the tools and concepts of Lean can be easily adapted to the Six Sigma DMAIC methodology. All the Lean tools and concepts, and even a few Six Sigma tools, are mentioned in this module, but there are really only two prerequisites that are needed for this lesson. One is on problem resolution using DMAIC, and the other is on the DMAIC roadmap. If you review those lessons first, it may help for this lesson. So let's start by reviewing the 5 basic steps for resolving a problem and how Lean and Six Sigma can be applied to them. As I reviewed in previous lessons, there really is a difference between Lean and Six Sigma, again affecting processes for Lean versus affecting the output for Six Sigma. So despite the differences between them, we still can adapt Lean to the Six Sigma methodology of DMAIC. So remember, when we've talked before about the DMAIC steps in Six Sigma, we talked about it in terms of the 5 basic steps you might normally follow when you're trying to resolve a problem. Well, if you think about it, Lean also is trying to resolve a problem, but the problem happens to be within the efficiency of the process itself. So if there's still a problem that we're trying to resolve, then it just follows naturally that we should be able to apply those same 5 steps for resolving a problem to Lean, the same steps that we applied to DMAIC. So let's walk through that. Like we did before, we showed how the 5 steps for resolving a problem could be beginning with understanding the problem, gathering reliable information, identifying the root cause, fixing the root cause, and then sustaining the improvement. I used the example of my daughter Hannah before and how the doctor had diagnosed her as having arthritis, but that wasn't the root cause. The root cause was strep throat. Hopefully you've already seen that lesson. I haven't spoiled it for you. But we adapted that same 5-step approach for resolving a problem to the Six Sigma DMAIC methodology, where understanding the problem is like the define phase, gathering reliable information is like the measure phase, identifying the root cause is like the analyze phase, fixing that root cause is the improve phase, and then finally sustaining the improvement is the control phase. Well, again, when we want to adapt that to the Lean sets of tools and concepts and the whole Lean philosophy, we might use this kind of method. For the define phase, when we're trying to understand the problem, that could be similar to saying we want to define the severity and scope of the problem in the process that is specific to the process, not necessarily the symptom as a result of the output from the process, but within the process itself. Well, then next, for the measure phase, where we're trying to gather reliable information, that's where we might want to measure the flow and capability of the current process. That is, again, the as-is process as it's currently performing. And then next, for the analyze phase, when we're trying to identify the root cause, that might be when we want to analyze the non-value added or those wasteful steps that occur within the process. And then next, for the improve phase, when we want to fix the root cause, that's where we might want to improve the process with a new streamlined process or a new process, the to-be process that hopefully is waste-free. It doesn't include those non-value added steps. And then finally, once we've got that improved process, again, just like with the control phase, when we want to sustain the improvement, we want to control the new process to make sure the improvements we put in place as we design that new process, those improvements will be sustained. Next, let's look in more detail how various Lean tools and concepts can be adapted to each of the 5 phases of DMAIC. So what I'll review now are the tools and concepts that are more related to Lean and show how we adapt those to the DMAIC methodology. And we're going to use that using the same type of roadmap that we have discussed in a separate lesson referring to the Six Sigma DMAIC methodology roadmap at the level 1 and level 2. So one of the things I want to point out is that the define phase in here is actually almost identical to the one that's used for when using a Six Sigma project where we're using the more Six Sigma tools. And the reason is because when you look here at the breakdown of the different questions and what we're trying to accomplish in what we're calling the define phase, like for Lean, the things are going to be almost identical that we're trying to answer. We're trying to ask that same top-level question. Do you fully understand the severity and scope of the problem? That's what we want to understand in this define phase, and we want to walk away with it. So just as we've done before in the other roadmap, if you cannot answer yes to this question, then we need to go to these next level of questions to figure out how we can ultimately answer this top-level question for the define phase. So that first sub-level question is, can you clearly define the problem and its potential impact to the organization? If you're not sure, then these are the tools or resources that might help you in order to answer that question. Once you're able to answer yes to that, we move on to the next one. Do you have a team that agrees with the project focus? Well, again, here are the tools or resources that might help you with that. Do you understand the high-level process related to the problem? And then next, when you can answer that, do you have a method for communicating the project information? And again, we're going to come up with the same type of outputs that we might normally follow when we're using a Six Sigma approach, because we're still trying to understand the problem at the high level. We want to understand fully the severity and scope of the problem that's before us. Now from this point, once we can answer yes to this question for the define phase, again, that's where we move on to the next phase, which is the measure phase. So at this point for the measure phase, again using the lean tool adaptation to this flow, the high level question at the measure phase would be, do you understand the flow and capability for the current process? Well, if you can't answer yes to that, then again, here are the questions that we want to ask ourselves in order to try to answer that top level question. So the next sub-level question here at level 2, we would ask, do you know what the time or cost metric is that reflects the output described by the problem statement? Well, these are the types of things you might use. You might use a takt time metric or first time yield or rolled throughput yield. Next, have you identified all potential input, process, output opportunities according to the flow, accuracy, and timeliness perspectives? Well, that's the IPO FAT model that might help in identifying those opportunities. Next, we might ask, have you mapped out the flow of the as-is process, including sub-processes that they're leading to, that is the inputs, or coming from, which are the outputs, from that target process? Well, if you're not sure, then the detailed process map or value stream map might help with that. And last, we want to ask within the measure phase, do you know if your process maps and the collected data are accurate, repeatable, and reproducible? And if you're not really sure, we might use a measurement system analysis or MSA to help answer that. Again, these are the sub-level questions that will help us in ultimately answering this top-level question for the measure phase. That is, do we fully understand the flow and capability for the current process? Once we can answer yes to that, then we're going to move on to the analyze phase. The top-level question for the analyze phase is, do you know what are the non-value-added or wasteful steps that are in the process? Well, if you're not sure and if you haven't analyzed the process in that way, then here are the questions you want to ask to help guide you in that direction. First, have you reviewed the process maps to identify all the non-value-added and the value-added steps? Well, if you haven't, then you might refer to these tools like the 7 deadly wastes, or identifying the differences between how you can figure out what value-added and non-value-added steps are, or looking at work in process, or maybe using a spaghetti diagram. Next, the question you might want to ask is, have you identified any steps in the process where 5S is not used? Well, you might want to use the 5S program to explore that, to figure out where 5S is not being used, because if it's not being used, again, those could present some opportunities for streamlining the process or helping to improve the overall efficiency of that process. Next, have you identified any push flows or any batch processing that exists in the process? Well, these are using the concepts of push versus pull and batch processing versus one-piece flow that can help in identifying these potential forms of waste. And if enough data is available, have you applied statistical tools to measure the input, flow, and output of sub-processes that could reveal additional areas of waste? This is where you're applying some of the Six Sigma hypothesis testing and those kinds of tools that might apply to the data that can help us to find these different areas of inefficiencies or areas of waste within the process. Again, even though this is more from a process focus, making the process more efficient using these lean tools, sometimes you need to apply some of the Six Sigma tools as well to this in order to make your project overall successful in trying to resolve the problem. Well, again, once you answer yes to all these questions, then you should be able to answer yes to this top level question again. Do you know what are the non-value added and wasteful steps are in the process? Once you know what all those are, then you can move on to the improve phase. And in this improve phase, this is where we want to ask for ourselves, do you have a new streamlined process design that will resolve the process problem? Well, if you're not sure, then you move on to these questions. Have you mapped out the flow of a 2B process, including sub-processes that are leading to, that is the inputs, and coming from, that is the outputs, that target process? Again, you're going to be using like a detailed process map or value stream map in order to build the new streamlined process that accounts for that. And next, do you know the level of rewards, that is the value, as well as the risk that should be expected from this new 2B process? If you're not sure, then you might want to use an impact matrix or something like an EPIC chart or an FMEA, something that can help you in identifying what those potential rewards and risks are for this new 2B process. And the last question you might ask is, did you pilot the new 2B process and did you get successful results? We want to test it to make sure this new process is going to work before we do a full implementation. Well, if you're not sure, then you might want to use some of the tools about doing a pilot plan or implementation plan, also looking at the pilot duration scorecard and also an MSA. Those kinds of things could help you in being sure you've identified all those potential risks as you start to pilot that new 2B process to ensure it's going to work before you implement the full process. Now again, once you can answer yes to these sub-questions, hopefully you're able to answer yes to this top-level question for the improve phase, and now you can say yes, you do have a new streamlined process design that will resolve the original process problem. Well, last, when we answer yes to that, we move on to the control phase. Does the new process resolve the original problem, and will it be sustained? So it's not just planning for it at this point and designing it. Now we're at the point where we can be confident that we have this process successfully implemented and it is resolving the original problem, and we know that new implementation of the process is going to stay there. It will be sustained. So again, if you can't answer that, here are the sub-questions you might want to ask. Did you implement the new 2B process? Well, you need to make sure you get it implemented at a full-scale implementation as you're expecting. Again, you might use some of these tools to help as part of that. And next question, did you optimize the new 2B process with controls and visual cues? Well, this is where you want to account for several areas to make sure the process is optimized as best as possible, like using a 5S program or implementing as-needed Kanban system or Pokeyoke as part of it. The next question is, are the improvements successfully meeting expected results? That is, are they sustained, and are those results in control? Well, this is where you might want to apply some control charts to help monitor that, to make sure those processes stay in place and that they're successful. Did you fully transfer control and responsibility of the improvements to the process owner? Well, if you haven't, then you want to make sure that you probably design some SOPs, some standard operating procedures, and build a control plan to help you as you do that transfer back to the process owner. And then finally, the last question you want to ask yourself is, does the team, which would include the sponsor and champion, do they agree with the project that it is complete and you've got the successful implementation of the new process? Does it resolve the original problem, and are they in agreement to that? Well, that's where you want to follow the basic steps for closing out a project and gaining that sponsorship you need to ensure the project is complete. Once you answer all these questions, again, you can probably expect that this top-level question for the control phase is done. That is, you can now be confident that the new process is resolving the original problem and that it will be sustained. So once you've answered that, at least at this point for the control phase, now you can consider your project in improving this overall process. You can consider it complete.
Alright, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
Well, I would recommend that you look at the different processes that you interact with on a regular basis and identify some of those processes that you think might be ideal for some sort of improvement, somehow making it more efficient. And then use those as a guide as you walk through the lean adaptation to the DMAIC roadmap, and try to walk through and see what tools or concepts are listed there that might help you in trying to improve that overall process, and see if there are certain tools or concepts you might find yourself using more often than another. But I would, regardless, challenge yourself to ask those questions at least within each of those phases, and let those tools and concepts guide you of how you might be able to answer those questions, and see if it does make an overall difference in improving that particular process.
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.